Okay, great. We'll move on to the next presenter. But I want to say thank you to Theron from Sewell Ross, who has been coming up here to Lubbock for the last couple of years, bringing a great group of papers. And we appreciate you coming up and hope you keep coming up every year. Thanks so much. So the next presenter, I think, will introduce himself. I believe he has...
I'll introduce him.
Oh, you're going to introduce him?
Yes.
Great, thank you. I'll just step out of the way and let you do that.
Hello, thank you for attending. This is Dr. Rajbir Parashar. He has taught at RKSD College in Kaithal, Kurukshetra University in India since 1992. His dissertation was entitled Modes of Subversion in the Poetry of Ted Hughes. He has published his research as well as poetry, which he writes in both English and Hindi. And his presentation today is entitled Imaginative Interplay of Hot and Cold Societies in the Early Poetry of Ted Hughes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rajbir Parashar.
Thank you. Thank you. Hope it is on. Na? Thank you, Robert. And when I thought of coming to Lubbock and Sowell conference, I was not really sure why I was coming here, but now I can understand why that intuition of coming was so compulsive and so strong. My paper is on imaginative interplay of hot and cold societies in the early poetry of Ted Hughes. And this term, hot and cold societies, is basically used by French philosopher and anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, and I have applied it in the poetry of Ted Hughes, the late poet laureate of Britain. I'm reading exact words of Claude Lévi-Strauss so that further we can discuss. Primitive people produce little order through their culture. Today we call them underdeveloped peoples, but they produce very little entropy in their societies. Generally speaking, these societies are egalitarian, mechanical, ruled by the law of unanimity. Civilized peoples, on the other hand, produce a good deal of order in their culture, as is demonstrated by the mechanization and great work of civilization, but they also produce a great deal of entropy in their society. Social conflicts, political struggles, all things which, as we have seen, primitives try to prevent, perhaps in a more conscious and systematic fashion than we might have supposed. This is unquote and quotation from Claude Lévi-Strauss. Strauss's term order is indicative of the rationalization that the life forms in the developed and technocratic societies have undergone. This rationalization is primarily responsible for the expansion of monoculture of industrialization and modernity at the cost of more viable forms of social and individual existence. Claude Lévi-Strauss's term confirms that the primitive societies are not backward, rather they have retained alternative culture quite skillfully. It is primarily in this regard that this worldview or ideology stands at a remarkable distance from the modernist or postmodernist way of looking at things, including the heritage of enlightenment. The categories of hot and cold societies are useful in understanding the formative process of Ted Hughes and his imagination. The following letters of Ted Hughes reveal a great deal about his preferences or obsessions that eventually take poetic forms. It is with this view that some pieces from the letters of Ted Hughes, edited by Christopher Reed, are placed here. The first letter. Sometimes I think Cambridge wonderful, at others a ditch full of clear, cold water where all frogs have died. It is a bird without feathers, a purse without money, an old dry apple, or the gutters that run pure claret. Second letter I am reading. When a man becomes a mirror, he just ceases to be interesting to men. But when a man produces just a little scribble with real life and joy in it out of himself, it lives forever because it actually is a bit of life and exuberance which people like in their company. But nowadays, people only live as they reflect their environments, so they best appreciate all the barren, extroverted symptoms. But in the great ages, people lived in their minds and their environment became transfigured with human life, which is still valuable. No person is interested in a dull reproduction of appearances in the end. Everyone is interested in solely in human life and the evidences of its most powerful interior episodes. These letters mark his Ted Hughes' intense awareness and deep sympathies for non human presence in the surroundings, an ambivalent relationship with Cambridge as symbol of urban civilization, his interest in great ages, awareness that exuberance is vital, his affirmation of human life, its powerful interior episodes, and a candid assertion that good art is built only on a delicate, distinct symbolic quality. This is broadly an expression of his territorial horizons that unfold gradually in his poetry. And if we start looking at Ted Hughes' poetry right from his first collection in 1957, The Hawk in the Rain, Lupercal, second one, and then third one, Woodrow, we find an obsession with the non-human world because he has often been even termed as an animal poet on the basis of these first three collections because he was using animal imagery abundantly in his early poetry. And in The Hawk in the Rain, its very title of the poem, it is about a poetic persona who is struggling to reconcile with a muddy landscape and finding earth itself as hostile as if trying to consume. In Hughes' poetry, we have this constant interplay of hot and cold societies, hot and cold cultures. Cold cultures as represented by the symbols and imagery of animals, birds, natural phenomena, and the hot societies generally represented by sometimes direct naming of figures of modern age and other times implicated through the consciousness of the persona who has all the qualities of a modern man and feels thoroughly uncomfortable in face of these different kind of images. So in early poetry we have this unique example of his poetry, his poems, titled like Egghead, Famous Poet, Vegetarian, Stations, and Wings, that directly treat human beings representing hot societies who are products of the modern rational tendencies of the last 300 years in Western world. Because in Ted Hughes, he is not trying to negotiate in a very negotiate the middle ground with these disasters in terms of human attitude towards nature. He is trying to bring back, or what he popularly says, that nature will reclaim everything that we have lost, and nature is going to be at the center of things. So in these poems he satirized the rationalist modern man's confidence in his intellectual powers, and he is targeting Einstein, Kafka, and other characters of modern age or science. And the goal of the poet is to shake the foundations of enlightenment, Western enlightenment, because he thinks it is not possible to address environmental issues by keeping intact those basics of scientific humanism and enlightenment. And in Wings in particular, a poem on Sartre, Kafka, and Einstein, he chooses eminent philosophers as actually the hollow men of this culture. In M. Sartre considers current affairs, the modern thinker is doomed because, quote, he regrows the world inside his skull, unquote. Like his ordinary counterpart, modern man, the thinker employs his cerebral faculty for wrong formulations and perverting goals. I quote from the poem again: angels, it whispers, are metaphors in man's image for the amoeba's exhilarations, unquote. For the same reasons, Kafka is an owl, and the scientist in Einstein plays badge is so debilitated by his own great shattered wing that he is a mental wreck. His memory is lifting what it cannot manage of the two worlds and a few words. Commenting on Wings, Keith Sager, an eminent critic of Ted Hughes, says, wings are for leaping off from earth towards the sun. The fall was from the grace of total self abandonment into self consciousness and blind rationality. As Blake chose real men, Newton and Locke, as examples of fallen man in his age, so Hughes chooses in Wings Sartre, Kafka, and Einstein as examples in our age. There are other poems in the Hawk in the Rain where Ted Hughes is basically trying to convey this fundamental dilemma of how to address this crisis of the natural world in his poetry and how to mend ways. And one of the key poems in that process is his poem Thought Fox. It is a poem about the poetic process, the creative process. And in that poem, he imagines through a very delicate and subtle symbolism how fox as an idea, it comes out from outside and enters the head of the poet. But the way this poem is narrated, it has a deeply symbolic overtone, which I would like to convey through the textual reading of some of its part. This is how it begins. I imagine this midnight moment's forest. Something else is alive beside the clock's loneliness, and this blank page where my fingers move, though the window I see no star. Through the window I see no star, something more near, though deeper within darkness, is entering the loneliness. So it is the poetic inspiration entering the loneliness of the poet who is sitting in a modern context. He is looking for light, loneliness, and all that. And then finally, towards the end, across clearings, an eye, a widening, deepening greenness, brilliantly, concentratedly coming about its own business, till with a sudden, sharp, hot stink of fox, it enters the dark hole of the head. The window is starless still, the clock ticks, the page is printed. So the page is printed because the fox as an idea enters the dark hole of the head. And in Hughes's poetry, we have this all prevailing reality of dark hole of the head, the consciousness, the mind, the very basis of Descartes' foundations of modernity is taken as a hole, a blankness, a void, something consuming our creativity, something consuming our relationship with the natural environment. And that's why he says, dark hole of the head, it is compensated by the incoming of an animal, that is a fox. And in the early phase of his poetry, he had another famous poem. I think some of you may be familiar with that poem. That is Ghost Crabs, Hawk Roosting, and Woodrow. Because Hawk Roosting is a poem which was taken as an example of his fascism. The Ted Hughes, his controversial relationship with Sylvia Plath and her subsequent suicide, and he so publicly defending it throughout his life. Only at the end of his life, towards the end of his life, he published birthday letters paying an emotional tribute to Sylvia Plath, otherwise otherwise defending his relationship and saying nothing about her suicide all that way. So after writing of this Hawk Roosting and its publication during his early phase, he was questioned about his cultural and political commitments. And hawk roosting, if I just read it, a portion out of it, I think that question of how the mystified encounter with imbalances in our environment, how it is stricken with certain consequences for our political and cultural way of thinking, that becomes very clear, because hawk as a bird is thinking. Ted Hughes himself said in this poem, the hawk is thinking. And then he, in an interview with Egbert Pass, he said, I think in this poem, nature is thinking. And how nature is thinking, for that I am just reading the text. I sit in the top of the wood, my eyes closed. In action, no falsifying dream, between my hooked head and hooked feet, or in sleep, rehearse perfect kills and eat. And reading some scattered lines, and the earth's face upward for my inspection. This is the hawk thinking. Now I hold creation in my foot. My manners are tearing off heads. These are scattered lines, the way he's speaking. And finally, the sun is behind me. Nothing has changed since I began. My eye has permitted no change. I am going to keep things like this. In modern hot societies, change is something as if natural. Change is something always speedily going on. In our own age, we find it. But in cold societies, whatever remnants of cold societies, primitive, more traditional societies are there, change is comparatively slow and they retain it. Ted Hughes, through the image and symbol of hawk, he reinforces something like an attempt to step out of history, because modernity historicizes, and he is trying to reconnect with the lost world of nature by stepping out of history. And in the same side, it is not always simple for Hughes to write in the same self-confidence as in this particular poem, Hawk Roosting. The hawk is speaking, or nature is articulating its future or way of living. Because in early poetry of Ted Hughes, we have a subtle dynamics of how birds and animals, they are treated through poetic forms. In his early poetry, there is a self-confident and assertive representation of animals and the natural world. But as the personal and intellectual orientation begins to face ground reality in a true form, because environmental crisis, it can be only imaginatively taken as that this thing or that particular effort will address the vastness of the crisis. In practicality, all of us feel particularly baffled at the real scale of the crisis. So in Ted Hughes' poetry, I have discussed dynamics of how there are certain changes. Towards the end of his early phase, we have the animals undergoing suffering. In the early phase, there is a poem, The Jaguar. A poetic persona visits a zoo, and in that zoo, there are several animals, monkey, snake, and several others. It is only the jaguar who is otherwise caged but is able to transcend the physical barriers of that imprisonment, that caging, and he is treated by the poet like a visionary. He is depicted as a visionary. He is able to transcend his cell. But he writes another poem on jaguar when we come to uh, uh, his third collection of early phase, that is Woodrow. In that collection, the jaguar is restless. He is no more the lord of his universe. In the third collection, Woodrow, there are number of poems. There are poems on skylarks, there are poems on rats, there are poems on bear, and there are poems on hawk, where the earlier self-confidence, earlier trust in the revival or the dominance of nature that the poet visualized in his early phase is scattered, and the animal world, the non-human world, is depicted as a victim, and that particular attitude of his early poetry, it is summed up in one poem. Its title is Woodrow, and here the counterculture that Ted Hughes imagined of cold societies, it is fully symbolized by a mythical animal who is unable to relate with the surrounding environment. I am reading from the text. I seem separate from the ground and not rooted but dropped out of nothing casually. I have no threads fastening me to anything I can do anywhere. So it's a poem about complete rootlessness, complete connection of those forces working for or symbolizing nature. And finally, before concluding this presentation, I would like to share one particular dilemma that I have suffered about as a reader of Ted Hughes. I belong to Haryana, a particular state in India. Haryana and Punjab, these are two states where we have agriculture based everything. When I was writing my MPhil dissertation in 1990 on Ted Hughes, animal imagery of Ted Hughes, at that time I felt that this poet is quarreling with modernity and enlightenment uselessly. He has no logic, because enlightenment is the basis of science and everything, and even of the day-to-day life and prosperity and comfort in less industrialized areas like my own. But as I went on doing my research further, and after research, I have come to this particular conclusion that Ted Hughes and the other literature on environment and nature, it has a value because this literature, as some of one of the speakers was referring to when reading ecofeminism, because this literature has an inbuilt ability to reconnect with traditions, and those traditions, they are so diverse throughout the world. And in Ted Hughes, we have a mythical pattern in his poetry. The same birds, animals, which are symbols of something, they are also working to address the mythical patterns of different cultures. And there are various studies on Ted Hughes, especially Stuart Hertzberg, who has worked on myths in Ted Hughes. And myths are that permanent source of connectivity among different cultures, from where we can dig out those futuristic connections that will lead to some way of common looking at the crisis. Not exactly the ultimate one, but one of the ways, one of the dimensions of looking at things. And even in our Indian culture, we have this Sanskrit saying of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the whole earth is a family, but practically that idea is simply there in script. Practically, Ganga is mother, Saraswati is mother. These rivers are feminine goddesses for people in usual addresses, but practically they are polluted. We violate their motherhood, their sanctity, their physical and spiritual sanctity in day-to-day life. So what we require is some sort of reconnection with past traditions, but also some real eco-critical environmental awareness, without which this negotiation between tradition and the level of crisis, it is difficult to address. And literature, I strongly feel like that of Ted Hughes, is a potent means to do that. And we have hundreds of writers throughout the world, and at Sowell you have so many of them. So thank you.